Welcome to today's South-South News. I'm Bill Miller. Why was the United Nations designed to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights around the world? How do the programs that are being carried out by the United Nations affect people all over the world? My guest today is someone who's very knowledgeable of the United Nations. Steve Schlesinger is a past director of the World Policy Institute. He is also a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York, and he is the author of Active Creation, Founding of the United Nations, which is a very interesting book about the United Nations, why it was created. Steve, welcome to South-South News.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's start off with your book. It came out in 1983, as I recall. Active Creation, the Founding of the United Nations. What was your motivation, your inspiration to write this book? Why did you want to do it and to tell the world about how the UN was founded?
You know, I worked at the UN in the mid-1990s, and one of the things I discovered is that most diplomats had little knowledge of where the UN originally came from. That intrigued me, and then I also got intrigued because I found out that the US had, in its own peculiar ways, done some spying in San Francisco where the conference was happening. So for all these reasons, I thought this is a wonderful topic to tackle. I also found out that nobody else had written about the San Francisco conference. There had been a chapter here, a chapter there, but no full-length book on it. And once I got into it, I found it turned out to be one of the most dramatic meetings on the face of this globe concerning the security of the world.
Now, the United Nations was founded basically June 26, 1945 in San Francisco, California. It came out of, I guess, the rubble and the ashes of World War II and the failure of the old League of Nations, which had a few minor successes, but not very many. How did those two events, the League of Nations and World War II, play into the creation of the United Nations?
Well, the League of Nations was born out of the ending of the First World War, pushed by President Wilson of the United States, who wanted to design some sort of security organization which would prevent the imminent conflict of another world war. And the problem with the creation of this organization, the League of Nations, was that it was too idealistic. What it did was it gave every nation a veto, which meant that a single rogue nation could block any action by the League, which rendered the organization basically ineffectual when a major crisis occurred. So it never passed the US Senate, which meant the United States never joined it. And for those reasons, by the time the 1930s happened and war was starting to break out in local areas, the League was totally unable to prevent that conflict from becoming the Second World War. It was only Franklin Roosevelt, the American president during that war, who decided that if we were going to win anything from this terrible calamity of this terrible war, we had to create another security organization that could prevent the further outbreak of conflict leading to a third world war. So it was he who decided and twisted the arms of Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin and decided to have a conference in San Francisco to draft the charter of the UN.
What were some of the major obstacles confronting the countries at the United Nations? And again, the key players, I guess, were the victors of World War II, the five major powers that came out of World War II. What were some of the major obstacles confronting them?
Well, the major obstacles were mainly the issue of the veto. This means that a single country would be able to block any action by the UN. As I said, in the League, every country had it. In the new configuration of the United Nations Charter, only 5 countries had the veto. That's the United States, China, Russia, Great Britain, and France. Now, this caused a great deal of controversy in San Francisco because the other countries, the smaller ones, said, well, why can't we have the veto too? But Roosevelt made quite clear, and the Soviet Union did too, that if they didn't get the veto, they would walk out of that conference. Roosevelt did it because he realized without the veto, he could never get this treaty passed by the US Senate, and he didn't want to have another failure like the League that had occurred. So finally, the smaller countries realized it's better to have the 5 most powerful nations on Earth inside than outside. And so they caved in and agreed to a formula which exists today, in which 5 countries have the veto. That was the biggest obstacle. There were many others. I mean, the colonial powers, Great Britain, France, Holland, and so on, were very concerned about losing their possessions. And that had to be worked out. and there were issues over about whether regional organizations should be able to participate in the UN. That was finally resolved, and regional organizations are a part of the UN Charter. But the greatest reason why the UN succeeded is that you have to remember in the First World War and the Second World War together, 90 million people had died. And the delegates who came to San Francisco said, we can't stand this anymore. We cannot permit another war to happen. And therefore, we'll buy into this charter, even if we're not totally satisfied with it.
And I think, was it Albert Einstein who said that given we're moving into the atomic age, that was back then, and now we're in the nuclear age, that if we ever fought World War III, the next one would be World War IV, and we'd be fighting with sticks and stones because there'd be nothing left. It'd be rubble. You mentioned the veto, and that's still being discussed today. We hear discussions on the Security Council, the most powerful organ of the United Nations, 15 members, 5 permanent members that you mentioned a minute ago, 10 rotating members who come in for 2-year terms, and they're talking about expanding it to include, to be more representative of the countries today. For example, bring in Brazil or perhaps Germany or South Africa or India or some other countries that are not there full time on a permanent basis, so to speak. How does that veto apply today? Do you think there's any chance that that will ever be changed? Because the countries that have it obviously don't want to give it up, and the countries that don't have it obviously do want to get it. But how do you see that playing out?
Well, you know, the argument for reforming the Security Council and broadening the number of countries with the veto has been that the 5 countries that were established as the veto nations in 1945 represented the political realities of that time. But here we are, almost 66 years later, in 2011. Why should those 5 countries represent the power realities of today's world? Of course they don't. Brazil, Germany, India, Japan, all should be considered serious possibilities for membership as full veto partners on the Security Council. The problem with it, if you drill down into the issues, is that for every country that wants the veto, for example, Germany and Europe, there's another country in that same area, geographical area, Italy, who opposes the fact that Germany should get it. Why shouldn't Italy get it? In South America, Brazil wants it. Well, Argentina says, why can't we have it? In Southeast Asia or in Asia, Japan wants it. India says, well, we should have it. So there's complications on almost every level. Plus, any of the 5 veto countries today can block the admission of any new member to the Security Council on that level, the permanent membership. So you have another level which can block it. All of these figure into the situation today, and my guess is that for all the reasons that people want to expand the legitimacy of the Security Council when it makes decisions, it's very unlikely in the immediate future that anything's going to happen to change the situation as it is today. I would like to see a change. I would like to see a broadening of the Council, but it just doesn't seem to be in the cards right now.
Politically, it may not happen, or it may happen. Who knows? Stranger things have happened, I guess, at the United Nations. We're talking about one highly visible organ of the UN, the Security Council. Another part of the UN that's highly visible, and probably the most highly visible, is peacekeeping. It was never included in the UN Charter, but the first peacekeeping mission was set up in 1948, a lightly armed group of observers in Palestine. Today, we see the United Nations has over 100,000 troops on loan from other countries, not UN troops per se, but on loan, in something like 14 peacekeeping missions around the world. How has that evolved, and what role is the UN playing in helping to achieve that first goal to hopefully to eliminate the scourge of war?
Well, the UN plays this role as peacekeeper mainly by default, in a sense, because when the Charter was established, it was basically designed to prevent the outbreak of war. It was a security organization. It doesn't mean that all the other parts of the UN are not important, but that was the key issue that the delegates dealt with in 1945. But as you know, by 1946, the Cold War began, and the Security Council result got paralyzed between the Soviet Union and the United States, each country vetoing the other. So what did that leave the UN to do? The UN then started to play a role which had never been quite anticipated in the Charter, which is to be a peacekeeper. That is, when conflicts were to break out and there was a ceasefire, the UN would put troops in to keep the 2 warring parties apart. And that role turned out to be a perfect one for the UN, because the UN was seen as a neutral arbiter in all these disputes. And that became almost the central mission of the UN for the next 45 years. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall that the Security Council resumed its role of actually intervening in disputes and sending in troops to prevent war. But the peacekeeping missions have continued, and they've expanded almost by 500% in this century alone. So you can see that the UN has an extraordinary responsibility now around the world, and it has more troops now in conflict areas than any single country today.
Mm-hmm. Certainly does. Now, why is it important for people in the United States and developing countries and wherever it might be in the world, why is it important for us to learn more about these peacekeeping operations and to be supportive of them? What are they doing? They help the people in that area, obviously, but how do they help people in other parts of the world and various governments?
Well, I tell you, from the point of view of an American like myself, they help the U.S. government tremendously, because it means that in these 14 missions that we're talking about, the U.S. doesn't have to send any troops, doesn't have to, provide weaponry, doesn't have to send over tanks and other armed vehicles, because the other countries who are contributing troops to these actions are sort of offloading those issues from the U.S. onto their own shoulders. So from the American point of view, it's a tremendous savings both in the risk of our own troops in battle conditions, also the cost to our security budget, and also the notion that this should be the UN's mission, collective security, the sharing of missions. So we support peacekeeping, by the way. We are the largest contributor to the peacekeeping budget. I think 26% of the budget is paid for by the United States. So it's not as if we're shunning our responsibility. But nonetheless, peacekeeping is also important because it brings in all the other nations of the membership list of the United Nations in the sense of contributing, feeling that they're part of, together acting as a joint unit to stop war. So collective security is the key here, and that's what the peacekeeping operations are all about.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly shares the burden, shares the expenses, and doesn't put any one country into a situation where that country is providing the troops. And it also doesn't, it does not make it look like it's some kind of an invasion from a foreign force. If you have one country going into an area such as the United States was viewed when it went into Iraq. There was a coalition, but it was really viewed as a US-led invasion without authorization from the United Nations Security Council. But this is a totally different situation with peacekeepers. What do you think are some of the, one or two of the major challenges confronting peacekeeping as we move well into the 21st century?
Well, I should say, you're absolutely right about what the UN does is it gives the imprimatur of legitimacy to any operation that is done around the world. Once the UN gets involved in a peacekeeping operation, most countries who are members of this great organization automatically respect what's going on, regard it as perfectly legitimate and lawful, and are willing to support it. So the UN imprimatur is absolutely essential. Now, in the future, the one problem with the UN is that it can't overextend itself. I mean, it has 100,000 troops plus in operation right now. Can it take on every small crisis around the globe? No, it shouldn't, because it simply cannot extend itself that much. This is where the regional organizations come into play. They're the ones who should be the first defenders, in a sense, to prevent outbreak of war. And therefore, you see the African Union intervening before the UN does. You see the Organization of American States in the Latin American area trying to put its forces in play, or at least its negotiators in play, before the UN gets involved. This is the role of any regional organization, and it enables the UN to only come in when the situation either gets desperate or when it's brought in to finally negotiate a settlement. So I think that peacekeeping has to be a kind of shared responsibility between regional organizations and the UN, and it shouldn't overburden the UN itself and therefore make it ineffectual in its carrying out its duties.
Now, we've been talking about the highly visible parts of the United Nations. Let's shift gears and go to probably 80% of the UN, I guess, really, that we really don't hear a lot about. And those are the programs dealing with economic, social, humanitarian development or assistance around the world, and they're extremely important. Of course, one of the ways the UN has focused attention on these particular issues was back in 2000 to develop the UN Millennium Development Goals, 8 practical, logical goals that could be monitored over a 15-year period to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal education for primary school students, to reverse the AIDS pandemic, those types of things. How are those, how is it in the UN's best interest in the 192 countries and the 7 billion people in the world to bring them in? How is it in their best interest to focus on these 8 goals and to see if there's some way to achieve them in the next 4 years that we have left in on this timeline that they set?
Well, I think the Millennium Development Goals are absolutely crucial to the UN's mission. One of the issues that came up in 1945 at the San Francisco conference was the notion that you had to deal with economic depressions of various sorts, because it was the 1930s economic depression that really led to the Second World War. And the UN decided back in San Francisco that it wasn't just security, it wasn't just the military aspect of the world's problems, it was also the economic aspect that had to be dealt with. And that's why ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, was set up at the United Nations. Now, the Millennium Development Goals are an attempt to deal with this issue, to, as you say, cut poverty in half by 2015, among many the other 7 goals. And it's, I think, essential that the nations that have committed to these goals, and that's the whole 192 countries of the UN, do their share of that work. Now, the problem is we've just gone through the greatest economic recession since the Great Depression. And a lot of these goals are being thwarted right now because of the need to recover from this terrible economic calamity that we've gone through in the last couple of years. We'll have to see how that plays out. But I'm hopeful that before 2015, many of these goals can be advanced. I'm not sure we can meet the actual goal that was set out by the UN, but certainly I think most nations have signed on to this in a way that is serious and intentful and desirous of results. So I think we're going to see something good to come out of it, and it does fulfill one of the great missions of the UN.
And it was interesting I guess it was September 20th through the 22nd of 2010 when they had the Millennium Development Goal Review Summit at the United Nations, and they did come out with a renewed sense of we've got to move forward on these goals, but also showed that some countries were moving very nicely in certain areas, others were not. They were losing ground. So it was a mixed picture. There were some successes, but there were also some failures, not failures, but setbacks, shall we say, as we go along. But it's extremely important to focus on those Millennium Development Goals and to try to achieve them. And of course, the UN system, one of the advantages, I guess, and you could speak to this better than I, is it brings the 192 countries of the world together to look at these problems and to focus on them.
There's no question that that's one of the great advantages of the UN. I mean, imagine this world today without this organization. Where would these countries go when there was a crisis? What would they do about the poverty issue? How would they control global warming or a number of the other major afflictions that we are facing right now? So the UN brings countries together, and as a result is able to get things started and get countries signed on to a common enterprise. And it's not just, by the way, issues like MDGs. Where do the global laws come out of? It's because the UN convenes conferences around, terrorism or criminal enterprises, and gets countries to agree on laws, and then they go to get them ratified in their own parliaments or legislatures. And suddenly we have, global laws which regulate how the world operates. So the UN plays that dramatic role too. All of these in order to create a more orderly, peaceful society.
Some foreign policy experts have, they've predicted, I guess, to some degree, or they've opined that the United Nations may, and we can never prove it, maybe you could, but they couldn't, has probably prevented World War III in many ways. Because if you just think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, We were at the last stage. They were ready to hit the red buttons, and if those atomic weapons had gone off then, we perhaps would not even be here today. But there are several other issues like that, but that was probably the most dangerous we've ever had. But the UN played a critical role as sort of a backdoor negotiating session. Remember Adlai Stevenson at the Security Council? Mm-hmm. But that's a critical role that the UN often plays, but never gets any credit for it.
Now, the UN is one of these, it's like a fire station. You know, it only operates when there's a great crisis, at least visibly operates. We know it operates all the time, but it's not in the public consciousness until there's a great crisis. And obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of those places and times where the UN played an absolutely essential role, because it gave both countries, Soviet and the United States, a chance to debate the issue before the world public, and in a way kind of forced the issue into a situation where the Soviet Union had to withdraw its missiles from Cuba. And it also enabled secret negotiations to go on behind the scenes at the UN itself. And that UN role has been played again and again. You can look at any crisis that has happened in the last 50 or 60 years, and you'll inevitably see a UN negotiator involved. And it's going on right now in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's countries that have been brought to peace in Guatemala and Angola and El Salvador. It's a quite remarkable role, and the UN gets very little credit for it. But then people have to ask themselves, where would we be if the UN had not existed?
And of course, we have a specific example in 2011 with the unrest that took place in Tunisia, Libya, along in the northern African states, Egypt, obviously. And the UN played a critical role, especially I remember in Libya. It was there not only to set up the no-fly provision from the Security Council, it also tossed Libya off the Human Rights Council, tossed Libya off. The World Food Program, a UN agency, provided assistance to the refugees, and there were literally hundreds of thousands streaming out. They had the UN High Commission for Refugees was there to help. And I do not remember reading much at all about the UN role in all of this. Why is that?
Well, again, this gets to a signal point about the UN's lack of people's lack of knowledge about the UN. It was the UN in the Security Council which authorized this mission in Libya to protect civilians from the forces of Gaddafi. Now, once you have that legitimacy that the UN provides, it's possible for the world to rally around what is going on in Libya against the Gaddafi forces. And the UN itself, if we didn't have it there, you would have seen occupations by, the British and the French forces, and it would have looked like a colonial effort, and it would never have gotten the support of both Arab nations and the rest of the world. So yes, the UN absolutely plays an essential role, and by the way, is still playing that role in Libya, since the Libyan situation is not yet resolved. But that's a very contemporary example of where the UN plays an absolutely significant role in making possible something that is acceptable to the rest of the world in order to prevent a much far worse outcome that otherwise might have happened.
And these are not easy issues to deal with. You hear so many of these people, these armchair philosophers saying, well, let's just go in there and take care of that problem. Let's just do what we need to do. Seems like we heard that in Iraq, we heard it in Afghanistan, we heard it in a lot of other places. It never happened. It did not happen. And you need an organization like the UN to bring these countries together to try to work out some kind of an arrangement that involves the majority of the countries, and to come up with some type of a situation that's in the best interest of everybody concerned.
Well, the UN over the last 6 or 7 decades has provided the world some of the most brilliant negotiators and diplomats that we've ever seen. And as I don't have a list in front of me, but if you were to go through all the conflicts that were settled under UN auspices, it is an extraordinary list. And it starts almost from the time that the UN was created. So yes, the UN is an absolutely essential instrument for bringing about pacification around this globe. And it's not something that gets a lot of credit for, but frankly, as I said, it's like a fire station. When people are in great crisis, where do they turn? They turn to the United Nations.
And the UN is the 9/11. You call 9/11 when everything else has failed, nobody else can get the job done. They dump these crises on the doorstep of the United Nations, and then the UN has to deal with them because that's the mandate for the United Nations. Well, the polls show that in the United States, and pretty much, well, overseas are even higher, but in the United States, polls show that the majority of Americans, anywhere from people in the U.S., from 48% to about 85% support the United Nations. But the polls also show that people in the United States do not understand the UN. They think it's a good idea to work in coordination with other countries to work through this international organization, but they do not understand why. And that's why we need to learn more about the UN, and people can go to un.org. They can go to southsouthnews.com and learn much more, because South South News is covering the UN in great detail. Or they can also, and they can pick up Act of Creation, the Founding of the United Nations, which is a fascinating book, and it's about the history of the United Nations, and it was a very interesting history, and it was one that had tremendous potential for failure at many points in the creation. But Steve Schlesinger, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on South South News.